The plane touched down in Havana at 3 a.m. Frank Sinatra stepped off, carrying a briefcase he never let go of. Inside was $2 million in cash, and the FBI was watching. February 11th, 1947. The night sky over New York was dark, and Frank Sinatra sat inside a private plane. 4 other men were with him, all in expensive suits, all silent, all as tense as Frank. Nobody was talking. There was nothing to say. They knew where they were going. They knew who they were going to see, and they knew this trip could change their lives forever. Frank was 31 years old and at the peak of his career. They called him The Voice. Young girls fainted at his concerts. His songs played on every radio. Hollywood wanted him. Everything was perfect. Everything was going according to plan. And now he was flying to Cuba at midnight, in secret, to see Lucky Luciano. Joe Fischetti sat next to Frank. Joe was a member of the Chicago mob. He stared silently out the window at the darkness over the ocean. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but carrying. "Frank, you still sure about this?" Frank turned his head and looked at Joe. "Too late, Joe. We're already in the air." "I know, but seeing Lucky in Cuba, if the FBI finds out..." "The FBI has no reason to find out," Frank interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was tension underneath. "It's just a vacation. A few days in Havana. We'll gamble, smoke cigars, have fun. That's all." Joe nodded but wasn't convinced. He knew Frank wasn't convinced either. This wasn't a vacation. This was a business trip. And the business, the real business, the dangerous business, was going to be conducted with Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano was the emperor of organized crime. In 1946, he'd been deported from America, sent to Italy, never to return. But Lucky hadn't stayed in Italy. He'd gone to Cuba, just 90 miles from America, close enough to run his empire, far enough that the FBI couldn't touch him. And now Lucky had called all the major mob bosses from America to a summit in Havana. Vito Genovese was coming from New York, Meyer Lansky from Florida, Santo Trafficante from Tampa, Tony Accardo from Chicago. All of them, every major family, every major boss, all in one room, to do business, to make deals, to divide up the country. And Frank Sinatra was there to entertain them. At least, that was the official story. Frank was a singer, an artist, an innocent guest, but the $2 million in his briefcase told a different story. A gift for Lucky Luciano, or a payment, or both. As the plane approached Cuba, Frank looked out the window. He could see Havana's lights, the city's glow stretching along the coast. It looked beautiful, exotic, dangerous, exactly what Lucky wanted. The plane landed at 3 a.m. The airport was almost empty. A few workers, a few security guards, and one man standing there waiting for Frank, wearing a dark suit, a fedora hat, eyes that registered everything. Frank stepped off the plane, gripping the briefcase tightly. Havana's air was hot and humid, even in the darkness of night. The man stepped forward, smiled, but his eyes didn't smile. "Mr. Sinatra, welcome to Havana. My name is Carlos. Mr. Luciano is expecting you." Frank nodded. Words were unnecessary. Carlos gestured toward a limousine, long, black, windows tinted. Frank and Joe got in. The other men got into a different car, and the convoy drove through the night toward Havana. The drive was silent. Frank looked out the window, watching the city. Even at midnight, Havana was alive. Bars were open. Casinos glowed. Music poured from the streets. This was a different world, different from America, different from New York, different from everything Frank knew. This was a place that felt free, lawless, dangerous, a place where rules didn't matter. The limousine stopped at the Hotel Nacional, Havana's most luxurious hotel, overlooking the ocean, colonial architecture, stunning views from every room. But Frank wasn't staying at the hotel. Behind the hotel, in a private villa, Lucky Luciano was waiting. Carlos led Frank to the villa. 2 men stood guard outside, large, silent, hands always ready inside their jackets. The inside was more impressive than the outside. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, expensive furniture. This wasn't just a villa, this was a palace. And in the center of the living room, sitting in a leather chair, smoking a cigar, looking at Frank Sinatra with that famous smile, Lucky Luciano. Lucky was 49 years old but looked older. His face was lined with years of prison, of exile, of violence, but his eyes were still sharp, still seeing everything, still calculating everything. He stood up and extended his hand. "Frank Sinatra, finally. I've heard a lot about you." Frank shook hands. Lucky's grip was strong, warm, controlled. "Mr. Luciano, it's an honor to meet you." Lucky corrected, still smiling. "Just Lucky. We're among friends here, Frank. Sit. Drink? Cigar?" Frank sat. He accepted the whiskey, declined the cigar. Lucky's eyes drifted to the briefcase, but he said nothing. Not yet. First friendship, then business. "How was the flight?" Lucky asked. "Smooth," Frank answered. He kept his voice calm, relaxed. "Joe found a good pilot." "Joe always does," Lucky said. "He's a reliable man. The guys in Chicago value him. They value you too, Frank. They say things about you. Good things." Frank didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Lucky continued, his voice still friendly, but something underneath. A test, an evaluation, a measurement. "You know, Frank, we're building something here. In Havana. Something big. Casinos, hotels, entertainment. Millions, maybe billions. All of America's money needs somewhere to vacation. Why not Havana? Why not us controlling it?" "Makes sense," Frank said carefully. "It does," Lucky agreed. "But to make it work, we need the right people, the right connections, the right ambassadors." Frank understood what he was saying. Ambassador, intermediary, a bridge between Lucky and the families back on the mainland. And Frank was the perfect candidate. Famous, respected, a star, someone nobody would associate with the mob. "What kind of ambassador?" Frank asked. "The kind who carries messages," Lucky said. "Carries money, carries information, maybe sometimes carries favors. In this business, Frank, everything is about relationships, about trust. And you're someone people trust, someone people love. You can walk through doors others can't. You can have conversations others can't." Frank sipped his drink, trying to buy time, trying to think. Lucky was recruiting him to be a messenger, a courier, maybe more. And saying no wasn't an option. You didn't say no to Lucky Luciano, especially not in his villa, in his city, in his world. "What do you need me to do?" Frank finally asked. Lucky smiled. "For now, nothing. Just be here. For the party. Tomorrow night everyone's coming here. All the families. And we need entertainment. You're the entertainment, Frank. You sing, you make them laugh, you make them forget about business for one night. Can you do that?" "Yes," Frank said. "I can do that." "Good," Lucky said. Then he looked at the briefcase. "Is this what Joe mentioned?" Frank lifted the briefcase and handed it to Lucky. Lucky opened it. $2 million in bills. 50s, hundreds, carefully stacked, banded. Lucky looked for a few seconds, then closed the briefcase and handed it to an assistant. He didn't count the money, didn't check it, just nodded. "Thanks, Chicago. And Frank, thank you for bringing this. Not everyone would do this. Carrying another man's money takes courage or loyalty. Which is it, Frank? Courage or loyalty?" Frank looked Lucky in the eyes. "Both." Lucky laughed, a deep, gravelly laugh. "Good answer. Very good answer. You're honest, Frank. That's rare. I appreciate it." The next day, Frank stayed at the Hotel Nacional. Lucky had given him the best suite, spacious, luxurious, overlooking the ocean. But Frank didn't sleep much. He couldn't stop thinking about what he'd done, about what he was doing. The briefcase, the money, Lucky Luciano's request. It all felt too real, too dangerous. At 8 p.m., Carlos came to pick him up. "The party's starting, Mr. Sinatra. Mr. Luciano is expecting you." Frank dressed, his best tuxedo, his best shoes. If he was going to perform, he needed to look good. The limousine took him back to Lucky's villa, but this time the villa was different. It was filled with cars, luxury cars, cars with guards everywhere. Inside was filled with people, men in expensive suits, smoking cigars, drinking whiskey, talking in low voices. And in the center of the room, through the cigar smoke, Lucky Luciano held court. Lucky saw Frank and waved. "Frank, come. Let me introduce you to everyone." The next hour was a blur of names and faces. Vito Genovese, the New York boss. Cold eyes, colder handshake. Meyer Lansky, the financial genius, calculating everything, missing nothing. Santo Traficante, Tampa, Florida, future king of Cuban casinos. Tony Accardo, Chicago, powerful, quiet, always watching. Frank Costello, Joe Bonanno, Tommy Lucchese. They were all here. Every major name in American organized crime in one room, and Frank Sinatra stood in the middle, shaking hands, smiling, acting like he was at a Hollywood party. But this wasn't a Hollywood party. This was a business meeting, a power summit, and Frank was now part of it. Dinner was lavish. Lobster, steak, champagne, dishes Frank had never seen. The men ate, drank, laughed loudly, but they didn't talk about their business. Not yet. First, entertainment, then business. After dinner, Lucky stood up and raised his glass. "Gentlemen, your attention, please. I have something special prepared for tonight. A performance from the world's greatest singer, Frank Sinatra." Applause. Whistles. Frank stood up, walked toward a microphone Lucky had prepared, and a talented pianist waited at a piano. Frank took a breath, looked at the room for seconds. All these powerful men, all these dangerous faces. Then he started singing, "I've Got You Under My Skin." His voice was smooth, flawless, perfect. It filled the room, enveloped every man, took them somewhere else. As Frank sang, something happened. The tension eased. The men leaned back. They smiled. For a moment, just a moment, they weren't dangerous mob bosses. They were just men enjoying music. Frank moved from one song to another, night and day. "The Way You Look Tonight," "All or Nothing at All." He sang for an hour, maybe more. He forgot the fatigue, forgot the fear. There was only the music, and music was what always saved him. When he finally finished, the applause was thunderous. Lucky stood up, hugged Frank, slapped his back. "You were magnificent, Frank. Damn magnificent. You see, gentlemen, this is why we need Frank Sinatra. This man is magic, pure magic." The men agreed. They smiled. They applauded. But Frank saw something else in their eyes. Evaluation, calculation, measurement of how valuable he could be. He wasn't just a singer. He was an asset, a tool, something that could be used. As the night progressed, the men turned to business. They talked about Cuban casinos, about drug routes, about territorial agreements, who controlled what, how the money was divided. Frank sat in the corner, drank, listened. He tried to forget, but he recorded every word, every name, every deal. And outside the villa, in the darkness, another man was waiting, with binoculars, with a camera. The FBI. FBI agent Raymond Brule adjusted his binoculars and focused on the villa. He could see people inside, shadows, shapes, vague figures. He couldn't see who was who, but he knew. He recognized them. Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Meyer Lansky, all of them. The FBI had been waiting for this summit for weeks, and now there was someone else, Frank Sinatra. Raymond took notes, took photographs, kept records. He watched Frank enter the villa, watched Frank leave, watched Frank enter again. And each time, Raymond recorded what Frank was carrying: briefcase, suitcase, hands empty or full. Raymond's partner, Agent Tom Becker, sat next to him and shook his head. "What's Sinatra doing here, Ray? He's a singer, an artist. What's his business with these people?" "I don't know," Raymond said, "but he's here for a reason, and that reason isn't music." You think he's one of them?" "I don't know," Raymond repeated, "but we're going to find out. We're opening a file on him. Everything Frank Sinatra does, everyone he sees, everywhere he goes, we'll track it, and sooner or later he'll make a mistake. They all do." The next morning, Frank woke up at the Hotel Nacional. His head hurt, his mouth was dry, his spirit exhausted. Did last night really happen? Did he really perform for Lucky Luciano? Did he really see all the bosses of organized crime? A knock came at the door. Frank got up, stumbled to the door. Carlos was there, holding an envelope. "From Mr. Luciano, Mr. Sinatra." Frank took the envelope. Inside was a note. Lucky's handwriting. Neat, clean, controlled. "Frank, thanks for last night. You were magnificent. I've included a small thank you gift. I hope for friendship. L." Frank looked back in the envelope. $10,000 cash. More than Frank earned in one night. Maybe more than he earned in a month. Frank held the money and didn't know what to do. Should he keep it? Should he return it? What did accepting it mean? And what about refusing? Finally, he put the money in his jacket pocket. It was too late. There was no going back. Frank left Havana on February 14th. The same way he came, at night, in secret, on a private plane. But everything was different. He felt different. He looked different. It had only been 3 days, but it felt like a lifetime. When he returned to New York, everything was normal. His career continued to explode. His songs played on the radio. His fans screamed. Nobody knew where he'd been. Nobody asked him. But the FBI knew. In March 1947, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover opened a file on Frank Sinatra. Official title: Francis Albert Sinatra. Possible associations with organized crime. The first entry in the file was simple. Subject spent 2 days in Havana, Cuba in February 1947. Purpose unknown. Association with organization members probable. That file never closed again. For the next 40 years, the FBI would watch
watch Frank Sinatra. Everywhere he went, everyone he saw, everything he did. The file would grow to hundreds of pages, thousands of pages, and all of it, started with those 3 days in Havana. Lucky Luciano didn't stay in Cuba long. In March 1947, the American government pressured the Cuban government. Deport Lucky, they said, or we'll impose an embargo. Cuba had to comply. Lucky was sent back to Italy, but it didn't matter anymore.
Damage was done. The families had met, deals had been made, and Frank Sinatra was their man. For years, Frank didn't talk about the Havana trip. When reporters asked, he shrugged. His lawyers refused to comment. Frank denied everything, everyone, every deal. It was just a vacation, he said. He went to see casinos. He sang a few songs. That's all. But everyone knew the truth. Hollywood knew. The mob knew. The FBI knew. That night, Frank Sinatra made a choice. He chose loyalty. He chose power. Not the easy way, not the right way. He chose the survival way. And the path he chose would follow him forever. In the 1950s, Frank Sinatra's career almost ended. His voice was gone. His wife left him. Studios started dropping him. His relationship with Ava Gardner was destroying him. Everything was falling apart. Then a miracle happened. Frank got a role in From Here to Eternity. He won awards. He won an Oscar. His career was reborn. Everyone called him the comeback kid. He was back on top. But some people asked questions. How did it happen? How did a failed singer get an Oscar-winning role? Frank's manager gave an explanation. Frank's talent gave an explanation. But the whispers, there were always whispers. Did the mob help? Did his connections arrange something? And if they did, what did they want from Frank in return? Nobody knew the answers. Frank never said. The mob never said. But Havana was always there, in the background, in the shadows, a reminder of that first deal Frank Sinatra had made. The 1960s were when Frank Sinatra was most powerful. He sang songs. He made movies. He performed in Las Vegas. He led the Rat Pack, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop. He wasn't just an artist. He was an icon, a legend, a force, and always, the mob was there. Friendship with Sam Giancana, owning the Cal Neva Lodge, doing questionable things with questionable people in questionable places. The FBI kept watching. The file kept growing. In 1963, something changed. JFK was assassinated. Sam Giancana was one of the suspects. And Frank Sinatra was the man who introduced JFK to Sam. Frank was the bridge between two worlds, between Hollywood and the mob, between politics and organized crime. And when the assassination happened, Frank didn't talk. He never talked. He never said anything. He never explained anything. Many people wondered, what did Frank know? What really happened that night in Dallas? And did Frank's trip to Havana, that meeting with Lucky Luciano, have anything to do with it? We'll never know the answers. Frank died in 1998. Lucky died in 1962. Sam Giancana was murdered in 1975. All the men who carried those secrets, they're all gone now. Only the files remain. The FBI files. Hundreds of pages. Thousands of pages. And it all started with one thing. A night in Havana. A briefcase full of money. And the choice Frank Sinatra made. In 2007, the CIA released thousands of documents related to the JFK assassination. Among the documents were reports mentioning the Havana summit, the meeting at Lucky Luciano's villa, all the bosses in one room, and Frank Sinatra there, among them, singing, entertaining, carrying. The documents didn't prove anything definite. There were no charges, no conclusions, but they painted a picture of a man so deep in the mob's world he couldn't get out. Frank Sinatra rests in his grave in Beverly Hills. The headstone reads, "The best is yet to come." Maybe it is. Maybe in another life, Frank makes better choices, cleaner deals, safer connections. But in this life, Frank Sinatra made a choice. In February 1947, he boarded a plane, carried $2 million, and entered a world he could never leave. And it all started with that night in Havana. The FBI file officially closed in 1998, the year Frank died. But the questions never closed. Did Frank really work for Lucky Luciano? How deep was he? How far did he go? And most importantly, did he regret it? Nobody knows the answers. But maybe the answers are in Frank's own songs. Like My Way, I Did It My Way. Maybe Frank lived his life exactly how he wanted, by his rules, by his choices, by his consequences. Or maybe that night in Havana, Frank made a deal he could never escape, a debt he could never pay,
a connection he could never break. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Frank Sinatra wasn't just a singer. He was a force, a player. In America's darkest world, the world of organized crime, of secret deals, of deadly loyalties, he was a player. And it all started with a plane flying to Havana at night, with a briefcase containing $2 million, and with a choice that would forever change Frank Sinatra's career, his life, his legacy. The plane touched down at 3 a.m. Frank Sinatra stepped off with the briefcase, never letting go of it. Inside was $2 million, and the FBI was watching. It all started there.